This video is brought to you by John Robson Guitar Tuition. If you enjoy the content, please consider supporting the channel by enrolling on a course, purchasing some guitar lessons or a t-shirt, or you can join my Patreon. Now, on with the show. Hello chaps, welcome once again to John Robson Guitar Tuition. As always, I do hope you're well. It's Tuesday today, which means we're doing a top 5 video. And the topic under discussion this week is one that was suggested on the live stream, ages ago now, and I completely forgot all about it until I was reminded again on the live stream a couple of weeks ago. We're talking about producers. You see, back when I was an adolescent, many years ago, obviously, first starting to buy albums, you knew what the band looked like. Obviously, there was often a picture of them on the album cover. And as you're on that bus ride home from the record shop, clutching your precious new piece of vinyl, you'd start to whet your appetite by reading the sleeve notes and the liner notes and so on. And there was always this role credited to somebody, producer or produced by. I didn't have a clue what it meant back then, I suspect, nor did many people when you first started to get into music. But what you did know was that certain names who were credited with that role usually meant that the album was going to sound really rather good. So that's what we're talking about today. Some of, not by no means, not all of, there's probably going to be a part 2 of this video, but some of my favourite producers, influential record producers who, kind of shaped the way that music sounded, either forever or certainly for a generation at least. They had an impact on the way that music sounds, basically. So let's get cracking straight away with
Phil Spector.
Yes, now I was in two minds whether to include this gentleman on the list, because to say he was a flawed human being is something of an understatement. Convicted murderer and, sociopath and abusive husband are all terms that spring to mind. But he did have an ear for what made a hit record, with his famous wall of sound, which, we tend to associate with, the kind of 60s kind of pop soul girl groups like the Crystals and the Ronettes. And but, again, then you had Ike and Tina Turner and you had the Righteous Brothers. So, he had a talent. He was a flawed, nasty monster of a man, but he could produce a hit record, and he was influential, so that's why he's on the list. Let's move on. Next.
Joe Meek.
Yes, indeed, Joe Meek, another very flawed individual. Tortured soul, perhaps, but, committed suicide after murdering his landlady. But anyway, that's not what this video is about. He was a pioneer of using the studio in a creative manner. Starting in the late 50s, before then, the producer was, usually some kind of white-coated lab technician kind of figure whose primary goal was to capture an absolutely accurate representation on tape of what that sound they were recording actually sounded like in the room. But Joe Meek saw his role as being, well, first of all, a composer. So many great pop hits. I mean, obviously Telstar and stuff like that. He would use the studio creatively. He was a very, very early pioneer of techniques like sampling, obviously back then using tape loops, but DI recording, compression, reverb, overdubbing. Yes, I know people had been overdubbing before then, but in the same way as people were doing finger tapping before Eddie Van Halen, he was a pioneer of using it in a much more creative manner. And he was another one of these celebrity producers, a producer who became as famous as the artists that he propelled towards the top end of the charts. And, I remember reading an interview with Jeff Lynne, again, another fantastic producer. Not on this list today, though, unfortunately, but there may be a part 2, we shall see. Saying that, all he wanted to be when he went into a studio was to be Joe Meek. So there you go. He was a massively, massively flawed individual, but a massively influential producer. Next.
George Martin.
Yes, indeed. No list of producers of note would ever be complete without Sir George Martin. He was the fifth Beatle. That's it. Apart from that, his career after the Beatles, Jeff Beck, Cheap Trick, UFO, America, the list goes on. But it was really what he did with the Beatles that cemented his reputation, I think. So many, first of all, he had that kind of nose for talent. The Beatles auditioned for him, and their repertoire of songs wasn't great. They were very much a diamond in the rough at the time, but they were a diamond in the rough. Do you know what I'm saying? There was something there that he spotted that plenty of other record labels at the time, Decca included, had turned down. Joe Meek had turned them down apparently, and he allowed them to flourish. That is, in many ways, I think that the role of a producer, it's not to perhaps define the sound of an artist, it's to get the best out of the artist and, make them flourish. And, so many great Beatles songs. I mean, Yesterday is the most recorded song in history because it is that good, really. And, it was his string arrangement, arguably, that string quartet arrangement that really gave it the lift. The trumpet solo in Penny Lane, that's largely down to George Martin. Many piano parts on many Beatles songs were played by George Martin. It's partly kind of, encouraging, and it's partly coaxing, and it's partly kind of saying, have you considered doing it this way? For instance, Please Please Me was originally kind of a slow Roy Orbison-like ballad. And he encouraged the Beatles to kind of up the tempo a bit, lads, a bit faster, and they were, thinking, this isn't how the song's supposed to go. But when they'd finally got it in the can, he looked over the mixing desk at them and said, gentlemen, you've just got your first #1 record. And it turned out to be true as well. So again, that role of coaxing the best out of a performer, that is one of the things that the producer is largely there for, and he certainly did it with the Beatles. Anyway, let's move on. Next.
Tony Visconti.
Yes, Mr. Visconti. Now, some producers have a signature sound, some don't. And I think it'd be fair to say that Tony Visconti doesn't really have a signature sound. It's difficult to listen to a track like Heroes by David Bowie and then listen to a track like Black Rose by Thin Lizzy and think, well, yeah, that's a sound that's, it's difficult to imagine that they are, the result of the same mindset. But again, going back to what I was talking about, George Martin, he really does have that knack of extracting the best performance and the best sound out of the performers he works with. I mean, we've got written here T-Rex, David Bowie, obviously. I mean, he was pretty much David Bowie's kind of right-hand man for a large part of the 70s. Thin Lizzy, Paul McCartney, loads and loads and loads of artists have worked with him and produced what many people regard as their best work, with Mr. Visconti behind the glass. So that's why he's on the list. Not because he's got an identifiable sound of his own, like, say, I don't know, Mutt Lange or someone like that, but because he just quietly gets on with bringing out the best of the people he works with. And that's, I think, what a producer should be all about. Next.
Rick Rubin.
He does indeed have his detractors, Rick Rubin. Corey Taylor of Slipknot has been very disparaging about him, as has Matt Bellamy of Muse. But I think he was necessary for the way that music needed to evolve as we moved from the 80s into the 90s. All of those big string sections and synthesizers and reverbs and all that kind of big bombastic, overly slick, overproduced corporate sound that 80s music became sort of synonymous with. He kind of stripped all that back, and you've got like an album like Californication, for example, or any of the stuff that he did with the Red Hot Chili Peppers, where it sounds like you're in the room with the band. It's, very, very little, if any, reverb, and it just sounds so kind of in your face and, honest is probably the best way of putting it. He does, as I say, have his detractors. I mean, he's largely credited with creating the loudness war, where, albums were and tracks were sort of, compressed and made as loud as possible. Any dynamic range was kind of lost in doing that. But you know what? If people hadn't liked the way those albums sounded, then they wouldn't have bought them. And it did become sort of a thing that a sound that people sought after, and like anything that kind of catches on, inevitably it ends up going too far and becoming a parody of itself. I personally like a lot of the records that he produced, but I can see why some other people don't. So there you go. Those are probably the first 5 of a 2-part series of videos of my favourite and most influential producers. Let me know what you think down in the comments if you've got any suggestions for people I missed. If there's anybody on this list that you think doesn't deserve to be there, leave a comment down below. I'm genuinely interested in hearing what your thoughts are when I do these videos. But that is pretty much it for today, folks. Hope you found it entertaining and interesting in some small way, and if that's the case, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell if you haven't already done so. And why not drop me a like while you're at it? Don't forget, as always, the live stream every Friday 5 PM UK time, where we drink beer and talk about music and guitars. Great way to kick off the weekend. I'd love to see you there if you can make it. But for now, I'll bid you all a good day and say thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your time. Look after yourselves, folks. Stay well, stay safe, and above all, stay sane. Bye for now.